My name is Jaden Brooks, and if you looked at me from the outside, you might see me attending upscale charity galas or driving through exclusive neighborhoods in the Pacific Northwest. You might think I'm just a man born with a silver spoon, someone who has always lived a life of luxury and privilege without effort. But the truth is completely different. I grew up in a massive, sprawling estate perched majestically on a serene hill in the quiet suburbs of Seattle. It was a classic-style mansion, a masterwork of stone and glass spanning over 18,000 square feet, complete with breathtaking hanging gardens that seemed to defy gravity and a private, shimmering pond that reflected the ancient maple trees surrounding it. On a cold balance sheet, that estate is valued at more than $60 million, but to my father, Daniel Brooks, it was absolutely priceless. My dad wasn't just a wealthy owner, he was a master architect who didn't just design landmark skyscrapers for major global corporations. He spent 15 long, dedicated years of his life physically building this house with his own two hands, stone by stone, beam by beam. Every corner of that home was tied to his dreams, his sweat, and his unwavering dedication to craftsmanship. In our family, none of us ever referred to it as a mansion. To my dad, it was simply home, a sanctuary built on a foundation of ironclad values. He used to tell me every single evening as we sat on the porch, "Jaden, remember this. A real home isn't built with money or expensive marble, but with the character, the sweat, and the integrity of those who live within its walls. If the people are hollow, the house is just an empty shell." My mother, Helen, was a finance lecturer at a local community college. She was a woman of immense intellect who chose to live with a simplicity that baffled our wealthy neighbors. She didn't wear designer labels that screamed for attention, and she certainly didn't carry handbags that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. But you only had to sit in on one of her lectures for 5 minutes to understand why my father loved her so deeply. She had this incredible gift for turning the most complex, dry concepts of investing, compound interest, and budgeting into vivid, inspiring stories that stayed with you forever. More importantly, she applied those exact lessons to our family life with an unwavering, almost military discipline. I still vividly remember a rainy afternoon when I was 8 years old. I had asked my mom for a new gaming console because every single one of my friends at school already had one. She didn't just pull out a credit card and hand it to me. Instead, she knelt down, looked me in the eye, and asked with a gentle smile, "Jaden, would you like to learn how to buy it yourself with your own hard-earned money? Because things you earn are the only things you truly own." So, I started doing chores that went far beyond my usual responsibilities. I spent months folding endless mountains of laundry, mowing the massive acre-long lawn under the summer sun, and even helping her organize my parents' extensive mini-library of thousands of architectural and financial journals. It took me nearly 4 months of relentless sweat, patience, and saving every nickel before I finally had enough. When I finally brought that console home, my mom didn't congratulate me on the toy. She said, "Jaden, you didn't just buy a machine today, you learned the real value of human labor and the power of patience." Never forget that feeling. Even though my family possessed enormous wealth, my parents made the deliberate choice to send me to the local public school. My friends there had absolutely no idea about the kind of numbers my parents dealt with in their professional lives. I took the public bus to school every morning, I ate the simple peanut butter sandwiches my mom packed in brown paper bags, and I never, ever wore flashy jewelry or expensive watches. One time, when I was invited to a sleepover at a wealthy friend's house, my mom pulled me aside and whispered, "Jaden, don't talk about our home unless someone specifically asks. Let who you are, your kindness, your humor, your intelligence, be what people remember, not the zip code where you sleep at night." I learned to live a double life of sorts, navigating a world where people assumed I was just like them, while carrying the weight of a legacy I wasn't yet ready to handle. But the truth was, I was being meticulously trained for a reality where the most valuable asset isn't a big house or a massive bank balance. It's how you treat a stranger, how you face a devastating challenge, and the unshakable honesty behind every single decision you make. My dad once took me to the very top floor of our house, a room he rarely let anyone enter, a study lined with rich, dark walnut wood and massive windows that overlooked the entire glittering city of Seattle. He stood there for a long time with his arms crossed, looking out at the skyline he had helped shape. Then he turned to me, his gaze intense, and said, "Jaden, one day, this entire house and everything within it will be yours. But I want you to remember one thing, that doesn't mean you belong to the wealth. Do not let the money own you. Let your value come from what you do with your life and the people you help, not from the things you inherit from mine. An inheritance is a responsibility, not a trophy. I was too young to fully grasp the crushing weight of his words back then, but looking back now, every syllable feels etched into the very bricks of my consciousness. That house wasn't just a roof over my head or a sign of success, it was a quiet, constant reminder that nothing in this world is stronger than ethics and integrity, especially in a world where greed is constantly knocking on the door, looking for a way in. I grew up with that mindset, carrying with me a quiet world that many people never get to see. I never forgot what my father taught me, that wealth without understanding, without a moral compass, only leads to ultimate loss. And I believed that with every single fiber of my being, right up until the person I loved most in this world shattered everything I held sacred. I met Jack Nolan when I was 35 years old. It happened at a high-level finance seminar in Denver, where I had been invited as a guest speaker to discuss the future of digital banking security and personal privacy. Jack was one of the attendees, sitting prominently in the third row. After my presentation, while most people were asking technical questions about encryption, he was the only one bold enough to stand up and ask a truly challenging, philosophical question. Jaden, is there a clear line between the convenience of modern technology and the ultimate, hidden cost of personal privacy? At what point do we stop owning our data and start being owned by it? That question didn't just catch me off guard, it deeply intrigued me. He wasn't asking to show off his intelligence, he was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand the human impact. After the seminar concluded, we ran into each other again in the coffee area. I realized very quickly that Jack was a straightforward, cheerful man with a very unique, refreshing way of looking at the world. He worked in digital marketing. He wasn't wildly successful or wealthy, but he was clearly passionate about his craft. Most importantly, he had absolutely no idea who I was beyond that day's talk. He didn't know about the Brooks name, the mansion, or the $60 million legacy. That anonymity felt like a massive, cooling relief to me. We kept in touch. The first few weeks of texts were strictly about work and technology, but they slowly, naturally turned into late-night phone calls that lasted for hours, weekend coffee dates, and then short mountain getaways just to escape the relentless pressure of our inboxes. Jack had a kind of vibrant energy that made my high-pressure, analytical life feel lighter, almost effortless. He wasn't fazed by my professional titles, he never once asked about my financial assets, and he seemed completely incurious about my family's money. Once, I jokingly asked him, "Jack, aren't you even going to Google me? Everyone else does." He just shrugged, pulled me closer, and said, "Jaden, I'd much rather learn about you from you than from a search engine. Your story belongs to you, not the internet." After 2 years of a whirlwind romance that felt like a fairy tale, we had a small, breathtakingly beautiful wedding by the shores of Lake Tahoe, surrounded by only our immediate family and a few of our closest, most trusted friends. My mom sat next to me while I was getting my makeup done, her eyes misty with emotion. She whispered, "Jaden, your dad would be smiling so brightly if he could see the man you've chosen today. He always wanted you to find someone who saw your soul, not your balance sheet." I believed that too. I truly did. If my father were still alive, I thought he would have liked Jack, at least, I thought so at the time. After the wedding, Jack moved into the sleek high-rise apartment downtown that my parents had bought for me years ago. For a while, life was perfect. But about a month into our marriage, I decided it was finally time to show Jack the true heart of my history, the home in the western hills of Seattle where I had grown up. I hadn't brought a single soul there since my father had passed away 3 years earlier. Part of the reason was that I wasn't emotionally ready to face the crushing grief that lived in those hallways, and the other part was a deep-seated fear that someone would see the house as a trophy to be won rather than a home to be respected. That visit happened on a bright, sunny Saturday afternoon. As the massive automatic gates groaned open, Jack fell into a stunned, heavy silence. He stepped out of the car with agonizing slowness, looking around as if he were walking into a dream world or a movie set. He stared up at the slate roof, the towering windows that caught the sunlight through the blazing red maple trees, and the private pond that still shimmered exactly like the summers of my childhood. I watched his eyes carefully as he entered the grand entrance hallway, taking in the familiar, warm scent of the walnut paneling and the intricate architectural details that my father had once sketched by hand on the very same kitchen table where we ate breakfast. "Jaden, you actually lived here? This was your childhood?" His voice was barely a whisper, thick with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. I nodded and replied softly, "I grew up here, Jack. This house is my father's soul." He gave a small, strange laugh, a sound that sent a tiny, inexplicable shiver down my spine. It was a laugh of disbelief, but that's when I noticed a dark, hungry curiosity flicker in his eyes, a look I had never seen before in the 2 years we had been together. From that day forward, Jack changed. The man who was once straightforward and cheerful began to disappear, replaced by someone obsessed with the technicalities of my life. He started asking constant, prying questions that he tried to dress up as casual interest. "How long did it actually take your dad to build this place? Who exactly manages the grounds and the gardens now? Has the house ever been officially reappraised since the market boom?" But as the weeks passed, the questions became more pointed, more legalistic. He started using terms like personal assets, inheritance taxes, deed transfer, and spousal decision rights. I couldn't deny the sinking feeling in my gut. Something inside me began to retreat, to feel cautious and guarded. I desperately didn't want to think poorly of the man I had sworn to spend my life with, but I also couldn't ignore the echoes of my father's warnings. My dad always said that the person who truly loves you will respect your boundaries, even when those boundaries are invisible and unexplained. A few weeks later, during a quiet dinner at our apartment, as I was pouring us both a glass of wine, Jack suddenly dropped a bombshell. "Jaden, I was just thinking, if something were to ever happen to your mom, who would legally get full ownership of the house in the Western Hills? Would it go entirely to you, or is there a trust involved?" I froze. The wine glass in my hand trembled ever so slightly, a single drop spilling onto the white tablecloth. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice cold and firm. "Jack, that is a private family matter. It's a Brooks matter. And I think you, of all people, should understand and respect that." He forced a smile, but it wasn't the warm, genuine smile I had fallen in love with. It was a thin, tight mask. For the first time since we met, I felt a razor-sharp thread of distance forming between us, a crack in the foundation of our trust that I feared could never be repaired. Then, the true tragedy struck. My father's health had always been a point of pride for him, but he was suddenly diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was a death sentence delivered in a sterile hospital room. I dropped everything. I paused all my major work commitments, I canceled my speaking engagements, and I rearranged every second of my life to spend as much time as possible at the hospital. I sat by his bed for 18 hours a day, reading his favorite architectural journals aloud, sharing stories from my work, and playing the old jazz records he loved so much. Jack, at the very beginning, seemed supportive. He'd bring me snacks, he'd ask the doctors general questions, and he'd pick me up late at night when I was too exhausted to drive. But just a few weeks into the ordeal, his patience began to visibly rot. One night, I came home around 2 a.m., bone-tired and smelling of hospital soap, only to find Jack standing in the middle of the living room with his arms crossed and a scowl on his face. "Jaden, how much longer are you planning to keep this circus up?" I frowned, my brain foggy from lack of sleep. "What do you mean, Jack?" "My father is dying." "I mean, I understand you love your parents, but our marriage also needs attention. You're gone all the time, you're always tired, you're barely here. I feel like I'm living with a ghost. I feel like I'm alone in this marriage." I stood there in total silence. I was too emotionally and physically drained to even attempt an argument, but inside, something vital cracked. I looked at him and wondered, was this really the man who had promised to stand by me through the darkest storms? Or was he just a fair-weather partner who only cared about the sunshine? A few weeks later, my father passed away on a quiet, gray morning. My mother and I were holding his hands as the heart monitor finally went flat. I didn't cry then, I just felt a massive, hollow part of my soul leave the room with him. The funeral was held in our family garden, a simple and dignified ceremony just as he had always requested. Throughout the entire day, Jack was there, but he felt like a stranger. He was polite to the guests, but he remained distant from me. He avoided my gaze during the eulogy and barely acknowledged the crushing weight of the grief I was carrying. But the moment the guests left, his energy shifted. After the funeral, my mother sat me down in my father's study and handed me a thick, leather-bound file. Inside was a meticulously prepared will. My father had left me full, 100% ownership of the hillside mansion, the place he had called the beating heart of the Brooks family. The house was valued at nearly $60 million in the current market, but to me, it was a priceless piece of my father's life. Jack heard the news from a distant relative during the post-funeral reception, and his entire attitude underwent a terrifying transformation. That very night, over a dinner that felt like a funeral in itself, he suddenly asked, "So, Jaden, now that the house is officially yours, what are you planning to do with it? Are we moving in? Selling it?" If both of our names were on the title, it would certainly make things much easier later on, legally speaking. For tax purposes, you know. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My heart tightened with a physical pain. For the first time, I saw with absolute clarity that Jack wasn't looking at my father's legacy as a family heirloom to be protected, he was looking at it as a prize to be claimed, a lottery ticket he had finally won. 6 weeks after my father's passing, the tension in our apartment had reached a breaking point. Jack could no longer hide his restless greed. He started asking non-stop, aggressive questions about the legal status of the mansion. Even though I gave him clear, consistent answers, that the house was a Brooks asset and would remain so, he kept circling back to the same topic like a shark sensing blood in the water. One evening, I was in my study, looking through a box of my father's old blueprints and keepsakes, trying to feel close to him again. Suddenly, Jack appeared in the doorway. He wasn't smiling. He had a look of cold, professional determination that chilled me to the bone. He walked over and slammed a stack of legal documents onto my desk. "Jaden, I've made a decision for us," he said casually, as if he were talking about what to have for lunch. "I just met with a very senior lawyer named Jerry Peterson. He is an absolute expert on inheritance laws here in Washington state. He convinced me that we need to move the mansion into a co-owned trust immediately to avoid future complications. We're married, Jaden. What's yours is mine, and what's mine is yours. It's just a formality to protect our future children." I sat up straight, my heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "No, Jack. I have told you 1,000 times. That house is a personal, direct inheritance from my father. It is not community property, and it never will be. You know exactly what that house represents to me." Jack stayed quiet for a long, agonizing few seconds. Then, a slow, terrifyingly arrogant smile spread across his face, a smile that made him look like a total stranger. "Well then, Jaden," he whispered, "I guess you won't be surprised to hear that I've already taken care of the paperwork. I've already done it." I felt the blood drain from my face. I couldn't breathe. You did what?" Jack pulled out his phone, opened an email, and slid it across the desk toward me. It was a high-resolution scan of a property title transfer form. It was stamped with a "pending official review" seal. But the most horrifying part was the names. My name, Jaden Brooks, had been crudely crossed out in thick red ink. In its place, typed in bold, black letters, was the name, Jack E. Nolan. "Jerry told me that as your legal spouse, I could process the emergency transfer paperwork if I could prove a vested interest in the maintenance of the estate," Jack sneered, his voice dripping with triumph. And guess what? I was so committed to our future that I already paid him $300,000 upfront from my personal savings and a small bridge loan to make sure it happened today. The house is effectively ours now, Jaden. You can't stop it. So, we can either live there together as roommates, if you want to be difficult, or we can talk about a very, very expensive divorce where I take half of everything else you own as well. Your choice." Every single word he spoke hit me like a jagged, ice-cold blade to the chest. I stared at the man I had shared a bed with, the man I had trusted with my deepest vulnerabilities, and I realized he was nothing more than a parasite. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my hands to stop shaking. I didn't scream at him. I didn't break down into the tears he was clearly expecting. I simply stood up, picked up the documents, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. I locked myself in the bathroom and called my father's actual, long-time attorney, the real Mr. Peterson, a man who had been my father's best friend for nearly 40 years and had known me since the day I was born. When I told him the story about Jerry Peterson and the $300,000 payment, there was a long, heavy, deafening silence on the other end of the line. "Jaden," he finally said, his voice thick with a mixture of pity and professional concern, "listen to me very carefully. There is no licensed attorney named Jerry Peterson in this entire state. I know every Peterson in the Washington Bar Association, and Jerry doesn't exist. You haven't been robbed by a rival lawyer, Jaden. Jack hasn't legally transferred anything. He has been scammed by a professional con artist. If he truly handed over $300,000, he just gave his entire life savings to a ghost. The documents he showed you are nothing but clever forgeries." I felt the air get sucked out of my lungs, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from grief, it was from a dark, ironic sense of justice. Jack hadn't just tried to betray me and steal my father's life work. He had been so blinded by his own pathetic greed that he had fallen victim to a transparent, bottom-tier legal fraud. He was so desperate to own me that he had destroyed himself. I walked back into the dining room where Jack was still sitting, leaning back in his chair with a smug, triumphant look on his face, probably already imagining which room in the mansion he would turn into his man cave. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I simply placed the original, untampered property deed on the table, the one the real Mr. Peterson had just messaged me, along with a printout of the statewide fraud alert for Jerry Peterson that I had just pulled up on my phone. "You crossed a line you can never come back from, Jack," I said, my voice as cold and unwavering as the marble floor in my father's foyer. "And because of that, I have no reason to stay with you for another single second. Look at the papers, Jack. There is no Jerry. He isn't a lawyer. He's a criminal. You didn't steal my house, you just handed over $300,000 to a con artist while trying to destroy the only person who actually cared about you. The trust is dead. You are finished. I am filing for divorce tonight, and if you ever set foot near my father's property again, you will be leaving in the back of a police cruiser." Jack's face went from smug to a sickly, translucent white. He tried to speak, his lips trembling, but I simply walked out of the room and into the bedroom to pack a bag. I officially moved out 3 days later, taking nothing but my clothes and a small wooden box containing every letter my father had ever written to me. I returned to the hillside mansion, the only place of true peace I had left in the world. But Jack's delusion didn't end with the realization of the scam. He was a man who couldn't accept defeat. A week later, the gate buzzer at the mansion began to ring non-stop, a frantic, rhythmic sound that echoed through the quiet halls. I looked at the high-definition security screen and saw Jack standing outside the iron gates. He looked like a mess, his clothes were wrinkled, his face was flushed with a mix of rage and desperation. He was screaming into the intercom camera, "Jaden! Open this gate. I have a legal right to be in there. We are married. You can't just lock me out of my own future. We need to talk." I didn't even bother going down to face him. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a confrontation. I simply picked up the phone and watched from behind the safety of the reinforced glass as my security team, a group of professional, disciplined men who had served my father with honor for decades, escorted him off the property like the common trespasser and threat he had become. I finalized a permanent restraining order that very afternoon. I no longer wanted to live in the shadow of a man who confused love with an acquisition strategy. Soon after, I received a final message from an old acquaintance in the legal field. Jack had been scammed out of a total of $360,000. The lawyer had completely vanished into the digital ether, and the police had no leads. Jack had lost his money, his professional reputation, and the only family he had left. I sat in my father's library that evening, the soft, warm light glowing across the polished walnut desk. I took out my father's final letter and read the words again. My dear Jaden, if one day you find your trust betrayed by someone you thought you knew, remember this: trust is the most precious and fragile thing we can ever build. It takes years of honesty to create but can vanish in the breath of a single lie. Don't mourn the loss of a person who proved themselves unworthy of your heart. Sometimes, losing what is false is the only way to truly keep yourself. I took a deep breath, and for the first time since the diagnosis, I felt like I could finally breathe. I was in control of my heart, my legacy, and my home once again. The divorce proceedings moved with a terrifying speed because Jack had absolutely nothing left to fight with. He had no money for a high-powered lawyer, and he had no legal ground to stand on once the evidence of his attempted fraud was presented to the court. We signed the final papers in a small, cramped, gray office in downtown Seattle. He looked like a shell of the man I had met in Denver. He was thinner, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were sunken with the crushing weight of his own greed. When the final stamp hit the paperwork, I stood up, looked at him one last time, and said, "I truly hope you find your way back to being an honest man, Jack. But you'll have to do it alone." I returned to the Brooks estate and decided to give it a new, vibrant purpose. My mother and I spent the next year transforming the mansion into the Brooks Estate Sanctuary, a boutique, high-end event space for intimate weddings, architectural seminars, and healing retreats. We cleared out the dusty basement and turned it into a grand, stone-walled hall. We expanded the backyard into a lavender-lined sanctuary where the air always smelled of peace. We replaced the dark echoes of Jack's greed with the genuine laughter of young couples starting their lives on a foundation of truth and transparency. One evening, nearly 2 years later, I received an unexpected email. The sender was Jack. He was working at a modest career counseling center in Spokane, helping people who had hit rock bottom, former inmates and those who had gone through bankruptcy, find a new direction in life. He wasn't asking me for money, and he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply writing to say, "Thank you." He wrote that my decision to end the marriage when I did was the only thing that could have forced him to face the hollow, greedy man he had become. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the maple trees, which were currently turning a brilliant, burning red. I didn't cry, and I didn't feel a need to reach back. I just felt a profound lightness in my chest, as if the very last stone had been lifted from my shoulders after a long, steep climb. The Brooks estate wasn't just a piece of property or a $60 million asset anymore. It was a living, breathing symbol of a woman's choice to value her own integrity over a toxic, parasitic attachment. I rest my hand on the wooden railing my father once carved with his own hands, smelling the fresh mountain air and the sweet scent of the lavender gardens. My father's true legacy wasn't the bricks, the mortar, or the $60 million valuation. It was the ironclad strength he gave me to let go of what was never truly meant for me, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you so much for listening to my story and staying with me until the very end. If you have ever had to protect your legacy, your family's honor, or your own mental peace from someone you once loved and trusted, please know that your boundaries are not a sign of weakness, they are your greatest strength. What do you think about the choices I made and the way I handled Jack's betrayal? I would love to hear your thoughts and your own stories of resilience in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and follow the channel so you won't ever miss the next stories about standing up for yourself and reclaiming your power. Always remember, no one in this world can take anything truly valuable from you unless you hand over your trust blindly. Stay strong, stay honest, and keep your boundaries firm. Until next time.